for the first presentation, I would like to welcome Ethel Brooks, who will be talking about the work of RomaMoma. Now, I just want to say that Ethel is also based in New York, or in New Jersey and New York. RomaMoma are based in Berlin, Germany, and Budapest, Hungary, but more and more they are worldwide. The ambitions have never been less than global, and they're getting there. And we wish them all the luck with the various projects that they are initiating and are in midst of. Ethel Brooks is an associate professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies and Sociology at Rutgers University. And she's also a former Tate-trained transnational fellow at the University of Arts in London, where she was between 2011 and 2012, as I believe. Yeah. She's a distinguished Fulbright Distinguished Chair, and in 2016, she was appointed by President Obama, our great President Obama, to the Brooks. Is that correct? We're saying Brooks to the United States Memorial Council. Is that correct?
Yes, I was appointed, to the United States Memorial Council, which is basically the governing body of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Fantastic. She's also, in a sense, here to not only talk about, but to let us know further about RomaMoma, which is a transnational collaborative and discursive art project funded and initiated through the European Roma Institute of Arts and Cultures and the Off Biennale in Budapest quite a while ago, I think that was. And she will introduce, of course, in Kassel, there was a very large group exhibition, which will center some of our arguments on, which its title was "One Day We Shall Celebrate Again." And it's, in a sense, in relationship to those ideas which were pertinent in that exhibition and the questions raised about the impossibility of a RomaMoma that we will carry through in this talk for the next 45 minutes. So I hand over to you, Ethel, and thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. I really thank you for inviting RomaMoma and inviting me into this conversation and for convening us together. I've been very excited ever since I first found out about pax praxis, and it's been a pleasure to converse with you. And I very much appreciate also the team behind who's been supporting the whole thing, including Nargol and Sara. And yeah, it's just wonderful to be here. It's an honor and a privilege. Shout out to my colleague Katarzyna Pabianek from RomaMoma and from ERIAC. And hello, everybody. I see Paul Goodwin here. So it's just lovely to see you all. And I want to begin, actually, Shaheen, following up on your introduction, where you talked about the exhausted archive of Europe. And, one of the things, and we discussed this a bit yesterday when we were chatting, this notion of the exhausted archive, and then from whence a kind of rejuvenation of the archive or a recreation of the archive will come. And of course, in good colonial fashion, Documenta in 2022, certainly the German government thought, well, we'll bring the formerly colonized peoples together to rejuvenate our archive. And I wanted to sort of say that deliberately, because I think there was a project that was really based in a kind of our archive. And the expectation was that, we would all come together, do something really lovely. It would be very exciting, and we could move on. And I think part of it is, what happened in bringing all of us together was a kind of excess that the powers that be didn't really expect. And it was I found it, I think a lot of us there, in place found it a beautiful excess, one that opened up multiple possibilities for solidarity, for coming together, and for decoloniality, that, you know, in moments, I think about which we can only dream. So when we talk about exhausted archives, on the one hand, I think we also have to talk about kind of the colonial project. And here I want to bring in Glisson, you know, where Edouard Glisson said, you know, wrote, "Our monuments are elsewhere." And it's something that I think about a lot as a Romani person, as a Romani scholar, in my writing, in my artistic work, because, you know, the kind of search for the monument, the destruction of the monument, you know, the ways in which we've had toppled monuments, you know, is always something that I think when we look for the elsewhere, when we look for the monument, we're already kind of capitulating in some ways to a particular relationship with the metropole. And although Documenta was really based in Kassel, right, it also was a possibility for deconstructing that, for opening up what Shaheen pointed to, right, as the possibility of the Bandung, which was the space to let us do our own thing. And to kind of begin and give a background a bit, because I'm not sure that a lot of you know the history of Roma in Europe, and particularly sort of how it was that we came together within Documenta as a collective of Romani artists under the banner of RomaMoma, which is a long-term collaborative project of Off Biennale Budapest and the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. And, you know, I'm a member of the Barvalipi Academy of the European Institute, the European Roma Institute of Arts and Culture. And, you know, we've been dreaming of a kind of possibility of a RomaMoma. And we've manifested it, and you can kind of look on our website and have a look at the Off Biennale website to discuss this, but through various iterations manifested as exhibitions, events, publications, performances, presented at sites across Europe and across the world. And what we've been doing through that project is imagining and prefiguring a transnational museum of Romani contemporary art. So we presented the group exhibition, One Day We Shall Celebrate Again, which performed a paradoxical double task. On the one hand, in the room behind the wall, so it was the large kind of central room on the first floor, we set out a show to show what's been invisible and invisibilized, and to talk about what's been kind of unheard in global, modern, and contemporary art, which again, I want to point out, has always kind of been supported through the projects of various nation states, where we set out a kind of task, right, for this transnational museum of Roma art, if one had ever been established, you know, parallel to, for example, I don't know, the Bellas Artes in Mexico, or the MoMA in New York City, or, you know, the Tate Modern much later in the 20th century. On the other hand, we were also looking to deconstruct the very institutional vision, this institutional vision of a kind of museum of modern art, or museum of art, by not only what we did in practice in the curation was to take contemporary art, living artists, and then with sort of iconic pieces of modern art, Roma art, and dispersed it throughout the Friedrichshain. And then looking at kind of that kind of scattering as a proposition for how we understand the dissemination of Romani art, and art of the colonized, the oppressed, throughout the world, in a way that kind of opened up questions of complexity, right, of identity formations, and of the possibility for coming together. Sorry about that. And so that project was one that was incredibly exciting, and it brought together, a number of us under the banner of RomaMoma to really stake particular kinds of claims within this space, which was clearly a space, a colonial space, a space of official kind of, a showcasing of perhaps European power. And, you know, the background of that, of course, for those of you who don't know, is there are more than 12 million Roma, probably 12 to 16 million Roma throughout the world. And Romani people came to Europe from various parts of India a millennium ago, right? So at the beginning of the last millennium. And in the process, you know, became Europe's perhaps first racialized minority on the one hand, and remain one of the largest minorities across Europe on the other. Romani people are in the US, as you know, as evidenced by my own presence in the United States. You know, there are about 1 million in the United States of us, another 1 million in Latin America, more in Canada, and in any place across the world where there is a colonial or has been a historical colonial presence, because, you know, people brought Roma with them as they went out into the world. And so, you know, there are things like, you know, particular language, you know, we some of the language that we use in everyday comes from Romani language, from sort of very straightforward things like lollipop, to in Spanish, you know, the use of chavo and some of the vulgarisms in Spanish, which I won't get into in this space. But you know, Roma have been everywhere. Our cultural influence isn't always recognized, but you know, it has been part of the kind of construction of how we understand contemporary Europe without ever being recognized as such. You know, and you can see that in music, in performance, right, in things like flamenco and Balkan brass, which is, you know, sort of globally circulating musical forms, but also in circus cultures, in different kinds of performance spaces, and in contemporary art and in modern art. So how do we understand this then? You know, thinking about kind of what it means for us to join the lumbung, because it was really something that, at least I personally, you know, think about constantly as a space of possibility, is really having, you know, those of us who are so often left out of dominant kind of discourses, right, to come together and think through, you know, maybe an artistic bandung, but perhaps, you know, a possibility of making actual change, not just rejuvenating the archives of dominance, but actually pushing, you know, forth the kind of larger exhausting of a colonial archive to make space for something new. So Romani people, you know, we're a multi-diasporic transnational minority. Upon coming to Europe a millennium ago, I mean, there was really the idea that we were dangerous, right? We were fortune telling. We were kind of going against the notion of, you know, Christianity as it was blossoming across the continent. And almost immediately we were subject to a kind of exclusion, of being labeled as atziganoi, untouchable, and enslavement in what is now Romania and the surrounding areas. And eventually, as maybe many of you know, we were subject to multiple genocides, but the most kind of large scale and the most recent was during the Holocaust, right? So the Roma genocide, where hundreds of thousands of Roma were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. And, you know, we are at once invisible and hypervisible in regimes of racialization across nation states, settler colonial formations, and regimes of belonging. And at the same time, we've been invisibilized in the histories and the archives and the juridical legal regimes of nation states, while being hypervisible in the racialized fantasies and carceral formations of those same regimes in popular imaginaries. So this particular combination of invisibility and visibility has rendered it almost impossible to kind of think through in a serious way a larger question of, you know, how it is that we've managed survival, you know, what kinds of cultural practices kind of have maintained through this continued exclusion, and how we maintain language and belonging across the centuries of genocide and expropriation by the state, capital, and other non-Romani institutions. So how can, I guess, one of the questions that we've asked is then, how can Romani art, Romani activism, Romani resistance persist in the face of what is in fact a millennium of exclusion and persecution? And in some ways that's been, we've been trying to answer that through RomaMoma. We've been trying to answer that through a kind of remapping and mapping, a kind of continual iteration, if you will, of Romani artistic practice as kind of a way of holding us together as a community, but also bringing us together with other communities. When I was writing, I wrote a manifesto for Documenta 15, where I said, the beauty that we share with the world, the ways that we teach, learn, and thrive have been built for us, by us, for each other, by each other. And yes, for you. We have healed each other, and through our fortune telling, through our metalwork, through our horses, our art, our caring for the earth, we have strived also to heal you as we heal ourselves. This is how we educate. This is our heritage. It's our culture. We heal, we teach, we share. We build new ways of knowing and new forms of being in everything that we do. And that coming together under the lumbung, right? And you see behind me, this was one of the parts of our installation in the Great Hall. And you have Tomás Pelli's monumental painting called Birth. And under it, you see that there's a kind of chalkboard, which so Birth is a quadriptych, and the chalkboard underneath is also a quadriptych on the floor with seats for people to sit with chalk. And it was a way of really having the community around us within the building part, the lumbung, right? The people coming together to kind of respond to the painting, to make art in this space, and to come together to think through creativity and the possibility for change. Tomás Pelli said, quote, "There are artists, and I consider myself one of them, who are inclined to depict the happy moments of humanity in a way that make happiness complete." And so our vision for that was really to think through what makes happiness complete, right? One is actually making space for ourselves, taking up space, not in a way that's kind of militaristic or a building of a monument or a building of a building, or in fact an archive, but rather taking up space as people, coming together as people, holding on to each other as people within space. And so when we were thinking about that happiness, right, the humanity, we were also mapping a kind of history for ourselves. If you look at, and you can't really see this here, I wanted to keep it in the background so that I look like I'm right there still, holding on to the practice and the experience of the lumbung. But Pelli's monumental painting depicts the origin stories of the Romani people, right? It's part of a larger body of anti-colonialist art that frames nationhood without nationalism. And I think that's really key, right? In this moment when we have this hyper-nationalism, the hyper-nationalism of kind of a reclaiming and a closing the borders of Europe, what does it mean then to build from perhaps, multiple origin myths, multiple iconographies, to create the story of people? Birth, we can see kind of, if you can see in the background, which I don't think you can, but I'll talk to you a little bit about it. Well, first of all, it was never exhibited in a museum, right? It was hidden away. It was at first put on a children's school, and then later on re-exhibited, but not really in a kind of dominant place. So this was the first time in half a century that birth has been kind of on a wall in a space where people could look at it, could walk through, and could, think about it as a particular kind of piece of monumental art. And it centers around the goddess Kali's offering of her son Manush to a deity on horseback that looks to be kind of floating above the world. And the Kali Manush story symbolizes in a lot of ways, it symbolizes the birth of Roma, the origins of the Romani people, whose roots in India have kind of, manifested themselves in Europe. Kali as goddess, right, as woman, as Black. Kali is the word for Black in both Romani, it's how we refer to ourselves, and in Sanskrit, as Romni, as Romani women. And when she gives birth to her son Manush, right, Manush people, as Roma, as human, Kali offers her son to the world. And this birth of humanity, right, the birth of kind of Manush person, people, Roma, also leaves place for kind of human, non-human relationality and the connection of Roma to horses, to dragons and ravens alike, which is, how Paley imagines it, but also to the world in a kind of deep and profound way. And so in that way, we wanted to bring birth as kind of the centerpiece of our exhibition in Documenta, as part of the lumbung, and a call to decolonize, and in the name of a collectivity, because he created the work for the school, supported by and supporting students and teachers in this Romani community in Hungary. And so we wanted to kind of call, right, for a grounding of our artistic practice in an anti-colonial, multi-being origin story that pushes back against hierarchy, that works to dismantle racist, classist, casteist formations, patriarchal formations, and recenters the margins, reframes humanity, and brings happiness. And so this was kind of the centerpiece, right? And from there, we also had across on the wall to the side, we had some installations by Omara, a Romani woman, a Romani artist from Hungary, who was just incredible at kind of opening up and thinking through her own experiences of racism, of sexism, of ableism, classism, and invisibility. We had Chaya Stoika on another wall, who, a survivor of the Holocaust, who came out of the camps unable to tell her story except through painting the history and the experiences that she went through across multiple concentration camps, which she survived along with two of her brothers. And we had Malgorzata Miragatas's work kind of outside, hanging, making a kind of home for Roma and for everyone outside. And this all was really kind of in conjunction with and alongside the work that other collectives were doing across the building, outside of the building, and across the city of Kassel. And I think one of the really amazing and special experiences and a lasting real engagement with Documenta is really marked by the kind of ways in which we as a collective, a larger collectivity, worked to support each other. And even in the midst of kind of, the increasing pushback by the press, by the German state to say, you're not doing this right, you're not including enough people, right? This is a very kind of close thing. And of course, then the accusations, that somehow Palestinians shouldn't be in the room, and that there was a kind of, one would say, the kind of ways in which the slippage of accusations of anti-Semitism came in, which, was a real kind of, I think, a blow, because on the one hand, the ways in which we understand solidarity is, of course, any kind of racism is something that we would push back against, and then to kind of be accused very much of reinscribing and reproducing racist formations in Germany in 2023, given the kind of long legacy of the long arm, shall we say, of German history, right? Sort of displacing that history of racism onto then people of color, colonized people, queer people, women, people who are actually trying to make something that was another kind of way of being together, I think was both shocking, right? And then the final accusation that we had somehow broken Documenta, which I think was how the New York Times framed it, was something that, perhaps it's a badge of honor on the one hand, but also I think forecloses and denies the kinds of possibilities that were raised through the practice of the lumbung, through the kind of collective practice, through the disordered and disorderly, spaces of the ways in which we were allowed to do what we wanted to do. And perhaps the last thing I'll say, and referring back to the Paley, but also to Daniel Baker's shadow diagram, which is that chalkboard on the floor, was that, one of the very small moments, but actually is quite emblematic, was this kind of larger struggle over the chalk on the floor, because we kept putting out chalk. And then the organizers of or the kind of people who were invigilating Documenta, right? The people who were making sure that everything was in order, from the official side of it, not from the lumbung side, kept taking away the chalk and saying, no, one must not have chalk in an artist's exhibition because, it could pave the way for vandalism. And then we'd put the chalk back and say, no, this is part of our exhibition. You need to leave the chalk out. Let people climb all over it, let people kind of sit, let people talk. So that became one of the big struggles that I'd be really happy to talk about as we discuss kind of some of this going forward. But, I have to say that one of the reasons why I wanted this image behind me as I talk, and I'm happy to show some other images as well from our exhibition, from the larger experience at Lumbung, is because for me, that kind of practice of being part of the larger collective, being part of our small collective of RomaMoma, and then part of the larger collective of the Lumbung remains, I think, a position of kind of hope and possibility that I hope that we can all kind of carry forth together to create happiness and to create possibility as a collective of collectives.